this paper is going to draw on my book, which is coming out in November, which is the first kind of in-depth study of El Sistema in English, based on a year of fieldwork in Venezuela. The international image of El Sistema's founder and director, José Antonio Abreu, is one of a benevolent, almost saintly patriarch. Admiring writers have likened him to the Pope, Mother Teresa, and Gandhi. Accordingly, Abreu and his organisation are presented in the international media as somehow above or apart from politics, operating on a higher, nobler realm. This is an entirely misleading picture, I'll argue today, one that rests on a lack of knowledge of Venezuelan history and politics on the part of music journalists who have shaped public perceptions around the globe. Precisely half a century ago, Abreu entered Parliament as a deputy at the age of 25. He emerged from a political group called the Developmentalists at the Universidad Católica Andrés Pérez, alongside Pedro Tinoco and Marcel Granier, two prominent conservative figures of subsequent decades. 10 years later, Abreu was still closely involved with Tinoco, an ally of business and banking elites, who was described by Terry Lynn Carl as a man of dubious democratic credentials, and with the Movimiento Desarrollista, now formally constituted as a political party, which was closely aligned to former dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Indeed, as part of his presidential campaign in 1973, Tinoco sent Abreu to Spain as his envoy in order to rally the convicted and disgraced leaders, remaining followers, to their cause. Abreu's political calling and conservative leanings are hard to mistake in these negotiations with one of Venezuela's most infamous caudillos. His formal political career culminated in his promotion to Minister of Culture during the turn to neoliberalism under Cap II, second government. It's little wonder that astute culture observers describe Abreu as a politician first and a musician second. In the words of one journalist, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a politician camouflaged by the modest attire of a musician, and that he's often portrayed in an unflattering light in leftist social media. El Sistema, created in 1975 and expanded dramatically in the early 1990s when Abreu was Minister of Culture, is a child of the Punto Fijo period, and in its conception and operations, it embodies Abreu's political convictions. He was a card-carrying developmentalist, and his great project displays many of the hallmarks of modernist developmentalism. The imposition by a member of their social elite of a huge Eurocentric project, the desire to transform individuals by placing them in a centralised disciplinary macrostructure, strict top-down control, the exclusion of alternative visions and critical participation, and a predilection for dazzling spectacle. El Sistema might be understood as developmentalism applied to music education, right down to its original premise, the idea of replacing the foreign musicians that dominated local orchestras with their Venezuelan counterparts, a kind of musical import substitution. It also perpetuates the paternalist power dynamics of the political sphere in which Abreu moved as a young man, highly disciplined, verticalist or hierarchical, with power concentrated at the top and operating through a politics of patronage. El Sistema is thus shot through with Abreu's politics. Abreu was Minister of Culture when Chávez launched his unsuccessful coup in 1992, so it's not hard to imagine how he must have felt about Chávez's election as president 6 years later, particularly since the new leader was well known to have little sympathy for classical music. Yet the programme not only survived the political about turn, but began to expand significantly, receiving increasing subsidies from the government. Over the last decade, it has drawn ever closer to Chávez and then Maduro, now operating out of the office of the president, with Abreu appearing prominently at important state occasions and his orchestras providing the soundtrack. This turn of events raises interesting questions. One is precisely how Abreu managed this feat. I heard varying explanations from informants in Venezuela. Some alluded to Abreu's famed lobbying skills. There are reports he focused attention on persuading Chávez's wife. Others suggested that despite the political gulf, there was an unexpected meeting of minds between two caudillos with a shared love of demagogic display. Orchestras were effective political tools, and supporting El Sistema added another weapon to Chávez's political ceremonial armoury. A key factor, however, was undoubtedly the project's increasing claims to offer social benefits to the president's main political constituency, the urban poor. As one high-placed informant told me, there's nothing that a populist politician likes more than the word social. The programme began to wave the social inclusion flag with considerable vigour around this time, and there's little question that the discursive framing of the project aided its survival and growth. Abreu began to talk of a new Latin American century where the artistic development of the young becomes a social revolution. Along with his description of orchestral participation in terms of solidarity, commitment, struggle, and the common good, this was no doubt music to Chávez's ears. Another key question is, what exactly are El Sistema's politics today? It started out, I've argued, as a direct reflection of Abreu's political ideology, but with the 1990s coups and election of Chávez, it took a different discursive direction. Nevertheless, its structures, practices, and personnel remained essentially the same. The result is a somewhat schizophrenic institution, one that espouses the dominant political vocabulary, but less so its values or practices. One that tries to avoid explicit political statements, but whose functioning and actions are pregnant with implicit and often contradictory political alignments and meanings. In some cases, such as events in January 2013, the contradictions are overt and much discussed. The official events to mark the non-inauguration of Chávez, who was gravely ill in hospital in Cuba, included a concert for the President's health offered by Abreu, Dudamel, and the Simón Bolívar Symphony Orchestra, who performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Abreu expressed his solidarity with Chávez, thanking the President for promoting the revolutionary rescue of 400,000 and up to a goal of 1 million children and young people. This enthusiastic and very public display of Chávezism was too much for many opposition supporters, and it unleashed a barrage of online criticism. Yet, ironically, Chavistas were also railing against Abreu. Just 2 days earlier, equally controversially, he had been photographed warmly embracing 2 VIP guests, with whom he had met to plan a concert for peace: the Colombian singer Juanes and the Spaniard Miguel José, both well-known, outspoken critics of Chávez. Leftists were immediately up in arms, lambasting Juanes and José for their views and Abreu for supporting them, accusing the three of being the friendly face of the international right. A petition appeared repudiating Abreu for attacking the image of our country in the world and demanding that Dr. Abreu give an explanation that justifies his invitation to 2 enemies of Comandante Chávez and the Venezuelan people at a particularly sensitive moment for the Bolivarian revolution. While Abreu shelved the concert plans a few days later, claiming that El Sistema was too busy, his efforts to play both political sides left many observers unimpressed. Other contradictions, while hardly hidden, require a little more teasing out. Popular participation in the political sphere is a key tenet, perhaps the key tenet of Chávezism, yet one roundly ignored by El Sistema. The programme notoriously hangs on the word of Abreu, and is handpicked in a circle. And it's hard to think of an organisation in which popular participation is less welcome than a conventional conductor-led symphony orchestra. El Sistema leaves most young musicians out of most decision-making, and it generally avoids the critical reflection and discussion that is necessary to promoting a healthy political culture, making its claims to serve as a school for citizenship rather threadbare. Its extreme centralisation contrasts with the devolution of power, or at least the aim to devolve power and budgets to consejos comunales. Democracy is thus one of El Sistema's weak spots. Its autocratic bent is evident everywhere, from conductors' podiums to the exhortation of its official historian, Chefi Borzakini, that in El Sistema, everyone needs to be in tune, fully in tune, in order to achieve unison. And her imagining of a future Venezuela that is perfectly in tune, with all its citizens joined in a single direction. It's not just that El Sistema is run undemocratically in the liberal sense, however. After Chávez's election in 1999, as I'm sure you all know here, the Venezuelan constitution was changed to promote a participatory and protagonistic democracy. El Sistema could not be further from such a vision. By ignoring the constitution's exhortation, the programme would run squarely against the government's efforts to empower the grassroots to promote social justice by fostering direct democracy. Ironic, considering El Sistema's worldwide fame as a social programme. Chávez's political testament, the Plan de la Patria 23-19, urged the radicalisation of participatory and protagonistic democracy and the broadest discussion among popular sectors. Again, it would be hard to think of a less appropriate tool for such a programme than a conventional conductor-led symphony orchestra. Nearly a century ago, in the Soviet Union, the conductorless pièce in fans was constituted as an attempt to bring orchestral dynamics and socialist politics closer together. But El Sistema has attempted no such musical revolution. Perhaps the central value of El Sistema is discipline. Abreu told an interviewer, "As an educator, I was thinking more about discipline than about music." In my book, I make a long Foucauldian analysis of El Sistema, something I think is crying out for. Here I'll simply state its conclusion. The programme is an archetypal disciplinary institution. The relevant issue here is the political consequences of discipline. As James Johnson explains, disciplinary mechanisms do not just render social relations less symmetrical and reciprocal, but crucially, they do so by simultaneously disrupting the communicative relations that nourish social and political agency, and replacing them with patterns of thoroughgoing objectification. As Foucault argues, discipline is the unitary technique by which the body is reduced as a political force, at the least cost, and maximised as a useful force. His suggestion is that intensive, specialised and disciplined training of the body serves to produce docile rather than politically engaged citizens. This argument has great significance for El Sistema, a project embedded within and funded by a government committed to integrating ordinary citizens into political processes. It suggests that the government is devoting large resources to a project that may be counteracting its efforts at fostering political agency. El Sistema is thus an institution that counteracts fundamental tenets of the socialist governments that have funded its dramatic expansion, and displays many features of the Fourth Republic political culture from which it emerged. Centralisation, clientelism, the concentration of power by a charismatic leader surrounded by a small inner circle of acolytes, a disciplined and hierarchical management style, a marginalisation of critical thinking and debate in the formulation of policy, a focus on cultural importation and spectacle, a philosophy of the bigger the better, an organisational culture of irrationality, disorder and improvisation, and a lack of financial controls and accountability. It's for such reasons it's frequently described in Venezuela as a state within the state. For all its implicit Fourth Republic politics, however, El Sistema's public position has become ever more closely aligned with the government. Abreu's political manoeuvres have been a big success from the perspective of funding, but have made him increasingly vulnerable to criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. Critics on the left distrust Abreu for his lifelong conservatism and close ties to CAP, regarding him as a Trojan horse of right-wing ideology within the Bolivarian Revolution. Others on the right, meanwhile, have been alienated by his alliance with Chávez and Maduro, comparing him to Herbert von Karajan under the Nazis, or a far cry from serene, depoliticised depiction overseas. Abreu's symbolic support for the closure of Radio Caracas TV in 2007 was the final straw for many. On the stroke of midnight, the channel went off air to be replaced immediately by a Sistema choir and orchestra conducted by Dudamel, performing the national anthem, inaugurating the government-run TVS channel on the same frequency. A politically charged move that created a host of enemies for Abreu at his stroke. With the outbreak of civil unrest earlier this year, such debates intensified. An open letter from the pianist Gabriela Montero to Abreu and Dudamel about their failure to react to the political upheaval going on around them sparked a mass of media articles and commentary. Critics attacked what they saw as collaborationism with a repressive government. A political dividing line appeared in the classical music sphere, with opposition supporting musicians organising protest concerts in Europe and the US, setting themselves apart implicitly or explicitly from Abreu, Dudamel, and their de facto alignment with the government. With the criticism repeated in major newspapers around the world, Abreu and Dudamel were subjected to widespread scrutiny in the international media for the first time. The claim that they were above politics became much harder to sustain. Thank you. If you're interested in these kinds of issues, I have a blog in which I post on these, and will do so around the launch of my book. Thank you.